Fight! Hello and welcome to another episode of N64 Magazine Time Capsule. Now it's been a while since I've done one of these episodes, so there's lots of people who maybe haven't seen the show before. So for the benefit of those that haven't seen the show before, just a little reminder that the best way to watch this show is in full screen and in full 1080p HD. That way, if you want to read any of the articles whilst they're on screen, you can just hit the pause button as we go through. Now issue 10 of N64 magazine was the December 1997 edition, and it featured a festive themed cover with Diddy Kong Racing being this month's featured game. There's also the ultimate festive shopping guide, with all of the big Christmas releases being reviewed. As usual, there are teasers of Zelda news, and the back cover features an ad for F1 Pole Position 64, which we've seen many times by now. Speaking of ads, we've seen this many times too. The Extreme G ad fills the next page, but this month's editor's letter is on the right and it talks about their excitement for their first Christmas edition of the magazine and their anticipation for the first snowfall of the year. Jonathan Davies mentions that they also have a full review of accessories just in time to help you avoid getting any poor stocking fillers on your shopping lists. The contents page informs us that inside this issue there's also guides for Pokemon, GoldenEye, and some tips to ensure that you'll master the battle modes of Lilac Wars. Turning the page and we have another look at the Ocarina of Time. It's quite funny because some of the screenshots here were not in the final build of the game, but the magazine is still stating that from Nintendo the game is nearly finished and it will be out in a few months' time. Little did we know then just how much longer we would have to wait to get this game. They also advised us to look forward to the N64 DD version, which according to Nintendo again was going to be a different game completely, with a bigger emphasis on exploration, whereas the normal kart version of the game is more action based. As I would have expected, the screenshots for Tonic Trouble looked awesome, and there's something about the quirky French art style I've always dug. The magazine talks about there being lots of characters in the game and a ton of expressions in their faces. They have also spotted a cameo by Rayman already, and believe that the game is going to be of the same level of humour and fun, and it really should end up being an enjoyable game. One of the most underrated N64 games is up next with Forsaken. The magazine states that it's being developed alongside Shadow Man, which is still 50-50 whether or not it will actually happen. Thankfully they did both end up being released in the end, and even in the screenshots I was looking forward to Forsaken because it just looked quite dazzling. They break down some of the game's weapons and also comment how excellent the lighting is and impressive its visuals are. Planet 64 has the news roundup, mostly coming from Space World 97. Whilst the event itself was happening at the magazine time of going to press, they had their insider information about what Nintendo had prepared. The orange box has the team's predictions for other things that they think will happen. Funnily enough, there were expectations that Mario Kart 64 2 and Super Mario 64 2 were going to be announced. Oh, if only we could dream. Or maybe not though, because on the next page Miyamoto himself confirms to Famitsu in Japan that they had Luigi up and running in the game, and that they were thinking about co-op play being a possibility for Mario 64 2. There's also news that although Nintendo was still very profitable, the PS1 nearly doubled the lifetime sales of the N64, and sales of the N64 in Japan had been well below expectations. Yoshio Hongo, who was the chief publicist for Nintendo, also dropped some big news that there were in fact 4 different Mario Artist games being worked on. Interestingly, they also had plans for an N64 printer to go along with the mouse accessory, but this sounded sketchy, and even they confirmed that the printer itself would be quite expensive. The Coming Soon section focuses heavily this month on fighting games. The magazine agrees that fighters so far had been generally poor on the console, but they had high hopes for both Gasp and Fighter's Destiny. Funnily enough, they have higher expectations for Gasp, which eventually paled in comparison to Fighter's Destiny. To the right are some other fighting games, and sadly Capcom had gone quiet on Street Fighter 64, so there's no news there to report on. Body Harvest has suddenly become the talk of the town after the smash success of Grand Theft Auto. The magazine has rightly heard that development had become a real problem for the game, and that Nintendo had yet again made the studio redevelop the game from scratch. There's also a first look of SimCity 2000, and news that it would be an N64 DD exclusive title to take into account the additional storage the format permits. A game called Spooky by UK studio ICE, who made the Total Carnage game on SNES and Amiga, is shown here. They inform us about the game's main character, and that it's a violent game aimed at older N64 fans. It sounds like a classic hack and slash game with its own unique style, but sadly, as we now know, this was never finished. In a great rumour, Nintendo were apparently going to ask DMA to make Metroid 64 when Body Harvest was complete. This was the first and last time I ever heard this rumour. In RPG news, there's info from Konami that Mystical Ninja had finally been greenlit for a Western release, and also that Holy Magic Century, or Quest 64 as it's known in North America, was also incoming. The Ultra release list has a list of all games which are known to be in development. There's a whole ton of codenames here, and so see if you can guess the final game from the publisher and release date listed here. Max Everingham is back with An Englishman in Tokyo, and this month he talks about how different Christmas is in Japan. With a predominantly Buddhist population, he explains the differences in how the Japanese celebrate that time of year. Right at the bottom of the page is a funny chap who's written in asking why nobody has ever made a computer with a phone in it yet. If only he could see the technology that we have today. Not only that, but he's also sent in a photo of himself posing next to his brand new 29-inch TV. I'd love to see what he'd make of TVs these days. N64 Arena is up next with full reviews of Diddy Kong Racing, Duke Nukem 64, FIFA World Cup 98, Chameleon Twist, and a head-to-head of Madden 64 and NFL Quarterback Club 98. Import Arena also has Puyo Puyo Sun 64 and J-League 97, so stay tuned and I'll be back after this short break. Diddy Kong Racing is one of my all-time favourite games. You'd probably know that if I hadn't accidentally deleted my YouTube review of it last year when I was half asleep, but until I get around to re-recording it, you'll have to take my word. N64 magazine also loved it, and they went into a lot of detail breaking down the characters, tracks, weapons and secrets. Personally though, I feel that they went a little too far in giving away so much about the game for a review, as at times it felt more like a player's guide. They even gave away the fact that there is an adventure 2 after you've completed the first adventure, and any kid getting this on Christmas Day must have blown through the game quite quickly if they had read this article. Thankfully though, and most importantly, they gave the game a star award, making this a must-own title, which I think is the right decision. Tucked away in the top right corner, they state that this is the best value for money game now on the console, as there's a huge amount you'll get from it both in single and multiplayer modes. Two of Christmas's holiday American football releases go head to head quite literally in this double spread face-off. They build it as the old favourite Madden versus the newcomer NFL Quarterback Club. I'm not a huge NFL fan, and so you can be the judge of which the better game was, but personally I much preferred playing NFL Quarterback Club 98 over Madden 64. However though, the magazine disagreed, and Madden wins by a slightly higher score. On a side note, how the heck can Madden 64 get a score of 92% and Diddy Kong Racing get a 90% score? That just doesn't make sense to me, although I will admit it is a different reviewer. Automobili Lamborghini is covered in quite a lot of detail for such a low scoring game. They note that they had high hopes for the game after seeing it at E3 this year, but it had sadly failed to deliver a good game in the end. They commended them for trying to put a 4-player mode in the game, but they are not so happy with the way in which it slows down the game even further. They love the cars but not the lack of customization, and list off some of the better racing games for you to pick up instead. FIFA 98 Road to the World Cup is quite simply put as EA making up for the horrific FIFA 64. Whilst they note all-round improvements and the advancements which quite surprised them, they felt that ISS 64 was still far superior in almost all areas, and so rightly scored this game below that. Duke Nukem 64 is naturally well received considering it is one of the more popular PC ports to make its way onto the console. Rightly so, they compare it against GoldenEye and Turok and state that despite having more features in both single and multiplayer, it still hasn't pushed the console hardware far enough. They really liked the multiplayer options and in particular the two-player cooperative campaign, but felt that the sprite-based enemies and often blurry textures really let down the overall package. On a side note, just look to those crazy high prices for memory cards to the right hand side from Daytel. I was a little disappointed that Chameleon Quest didn't get more praise. The magazine enjoyed the unusual gameplay mechanics but said that the visuals and really short single player mode let the game down badly. They mentioned however that they really enjoyed the multiplayer mode and found that there was more enjoyment in that than the single player experience. A score of 70% seems low, but when you consider the game was up against for your hard earned money, it really doesn't seem that bad for the time. N64 Arena has Puyo Puyo 64, and I've no doubt that you will have played a Puyo Puyo game on some system in your lifetime, and so you'd really know what to expect from this review, as the game doesn't really bring anything unremarkably different for this release. The magazine states that the N64 is basically being used as a SNES emulator for this title, and if you're looking for an interesting puzzler, then this is definitely a game to consider importing. J-League 11B is an interesting attempt at a football game that was poorly executed. You basically build up your own team from scratch, and as the game has a weird camera system, it automatically changes position when you get the ball. It's an odd title and a really strange game, and to be honest it's not a great football game either. I'll eventually get around to reviewing it fully for an N64 Japanese Eye episode. This month's how-to guide starts off with Pocket Monsters, and so began the hype surrounding the Pokemon series coming to the West. What's interesting here, in my opinion, is that they took screenshots on a camera looking at the Game Boy screen itself, rather than taking screenshots using a Wide Boy 64. Still, if you want to reminisce about the early days of the series, then this is an interesting take on a Westerner's opinion of the first Game Boy release. We also have a guide on how to unlock all of the cheats for GoldenEye 64 to give you many more multiplayer modifications. I'd almost forgotten about some of these, and so it took me right back to when I used this very guide to unlock as many as possible when I was younger. The next part of this bumper how-to guide is all about N64 accessories. I just wish my parents had seen this before buying me the dreadful LX4 controller, which to this day I believe is the worst N64 controller ever made. Let me know below if you too have had to try and play this monstrosity of a controller. Naturally though, all of Nintendo's first party accessories score highly, but there are some solid cheaper alternatives which you may have considered back in the day. The lead section is quite interesting as they recommend the Spook S-Video cable for the best picture quality. Incidentally, that's the exact very cable that I used to capture footage for reviews, and at one time a pound shop here in England was selling them for 99p each. Finally, the how-to section ends with a masterclass in how to get awesome at Star Fox 64's multiplayer mode. I personally was never a fan of the battle modes in this game, but those of you who were probably already know most of the tips this guide contains. Tips Extra gives some cheats and codes for popular games such as GoldenEye and Lilac Wars, as well as some forgettable titles including Clay Fighter. The reader's tips are actually more like quirky glitches for games like Mario Kart and Pilot Wings. I always liked just how creative gamers were, even back then, in trying to find weird and wonderful exploits. The Nintendo hotline, just to remind you, was actually a local rate number which you could call to get expert advice. I was always surprised that this wasn't a premium rate number, and so the magazine took the most common calls and put the advice into the next few pages. Top Gear Rally was the big title this month, and so there's some nice tips and shortcuts for you to try. I'm the Best has some readers' fastest times and highest scores. Remember, these all needed to be proven with either a VHS footage tape or photo evidence to enter the list. The winner of Doom 64's competition is also announced, and the winner, well, he sent in a really crazy photo of him looking a little bit like Simon Cowell, and you can see that in the top right hand corner. Stuart Richards from Dorking has a sublime time which is confirmed on the Turok Time Challenge mode, more than a minute quicker than any other entrant. Club 64 was always one of my favourite sections, and this month an eagle-eyed reader has written in asking about some prototype vehicles he saw in screenshots of Blast Corps. One chap has also written in complaining about the magazine's large number of import reviews, without realising perhaps that the magazine has actually reviewed every single PAL N64 release so far. Dream On has more readers' game ideas. and if you're from the UK you'll no doubt get a chuckle from one of the readers suggesting a kart-based racer featuring the Chuckle Brothers. If you're not from the UK then YouTube the Chuckle Brothers and you'll see just how absurd this idea is. Invention Corner also has reader suggestions for N64 related hardware devices. Readers seem obsessed with fixes for the N64's often underappreciated controller, and one fan has a nice suggestion for a slight stick inspired Star Fox controller. It's very much like a flight stick that you'd get on a PC back in the day. A double spread of advertisements are up next, and yet again the advert for custom N64 controllers is a real eye catcher. Funnily enough, I've never seen any of these controllers for sale on the second-hand market, so they mustn't have sold too many of them. What's even funnier though is that their address is only 5 minutes from where I live now, and so I went and checked to see if the store is still there. Sadly, it appears they went into liquidation in 2006, and so I couldn't see if they still had any old stock hanging around. They also still have an outstanding charge against the company, and so I doubt they'll have anything left at all because it will have all been sold off. More self-promotion on the next pages, which includes an offer of a free controller if you subscribe to the magazine. Eventually they would start offering free games to do so. There's also a promise of an in-depth interview with Rare in this month's issue of Edge magazine. The N64 directory has brief overviews of all games released as well as their scores, which was often a go-to list when I was considering picking up a new game. For games which weren't or hadn't yet got a PAL release, there's also the directory of the import games so you can see their scores and reviews too. In a preview of next month's magazine, they promise a full report from Space World 97 and also give you a heads up that there will be a free gift with the next issue and it will be available on New Year's Eve. And so that brings us to the end of the first year of N64 magazine. 1997 was a mixed year for the N64, and the magazine never shied away from that fact. But in the next episode we jump into issue 11, which kicked off one of the best years of the N64's history. So as always, thanks for watching, and until next time.